All right, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Yeah, doing great, doing great. We've got a lot to get into today, so let's just go ahead and jump right in.
That's it.
All right, fantastic. So, yeah, why don't you lead us out here? We've got some logical reasoning tips, some reading comprehension tips, some stuff that's a little more granular than we've talked about previously. So, um, yeah, why don't you take the lead here?
Yeah. So nice to see you, John. So for today, I was thinking one thing that we can talk about is predicting answers. And I think that's a hallmark of um, higher level reasoning. So
Yep.
as a student builds the foundation, then in predicting answers, it's more of an active process rather than letting the test take you this
Yeah.
way or that way. Um, what Um, what's been your experience in teaching students and kind of getting them to predict answers?
Yeah, I would say that if you're not predicting answer choices, you're really not even you're not studying for the LSAT.
Yeah.
I would go as far as saying that. Like you can get better without doing it. Will you ever reach all the way to your full potential? Will you get to that elite zone? No, I don't think so. For the vast majority of people. Now, there's some people who will just get there because they start there, essentially.
Yeah.
Um, but they're probably doing that process internally anyways. Now, the thing with predicting that I think people don't understand is that you're going to really suck at it at first. Like,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, you're like really like it's gonna be you're gonna be so far off and things are good. But like once you predict and you're really far off and you see where they actually went, you get a little bit closer to where they are. And it's like this thing that happens over a great deal of time, like months worth of time. So it's not something you can just like implement at the very end or in the last 2 weeks, like, all right, I'm going to start this predicting thing. Like, it's a skill that really needs to be built and
Yeah.
honed and dialed in to the LSAT specifically over the course of many months.
Yeah. I think I like what you said about, um, if you're not doing this, something's really missing in this whole process, right? And I think
Yeah.
one thing that we've talked about a lot is, everyone's going to have different goals. Some people, above 160 or 165. So everyone's journey is going to be different. But I think this advice is so crucial. So regardless of where the goal is, this is something that can get you wherever that goal post is. So I think this is
Yeah.
something that everyone should be doing.
Yeah.
Um,
And there's very few things where we can say like every single person,
yeah,
and even then we say, all right, there might be some tiny exceptions at the very high end. If you start at a
yeah,
173, all right, like you're you're a different animal, right? You're probably not watching
yeah,
the podcast either, right?
yeah.
So, but for everybody else, I'd say literally every other person should be working on the skill of predicting. But I guess what about this, JP? It's too slow. I can't do it fast enough.
I think, and this is something we've touched on before. The process, it's usually not going to be clean. You're going to be through the woods. The clothes are going to get dirty, and even if it's not very intuitive at first, usually it's not.
Right.
um it's still good to go through the range of motion and practice, right? So I had a student recently where we're trying to put this into play, and we're specifically looking at like resolving paradoxes, right? And then as I was walking him through it, I asked him, I was like, you have this component, you have that one. Even if your prediction isn't within the options, the fact that you're engaging in this world, right? And then you see the parts of it, and what could work and what could work, what could work, what couldn't work.
Yeah.
That in itself is so valuable, right? Because you're actively thinking about how that world looks like, and what can and how to navigate within that world. So he was like, oh, I guess, and I'm way off base. I'm saying like, no, you're going through the process, and slowly but surely it'll come more naturally, and it'll come a little faster. And also you'll be able to tell, like, oh, they're setting me up. I've fallen down too many times before. So
Yeah.
um def keep at it, even if it's slow.
Yeah, and maybe one thing that's a little counterintuitive too is that like when you predict and they set you up, and then you fall for it and you end up in the trap, that hurts like 10 times more than not really realizing how you got in the trap in the first place,
Yeah.
and just ending up there. So that pain that you feel of like, oh my gosh, they like set me up and I went hook, line, and sinker,
Yeah.
that pain can be a good deterrent to doing it again.
Yeah.
And it can be something that like really sticks inside of your brain and like helps you make the adjustment that's necessary to not fall in the trap next time. But if you just find yourself in the trap, one, it's not that painful. You're like, oh, I guess it's just, I just got it wrong. And two, you don't know the thought process that they walked you through to get you into the trap to be able to avoid it the next time.
John, I think that's an excellent point. And that should serve, I think, as a very encouraging thing, because regardless of the domain that we're applying it in, right? Say, I guess let's look at this one, for example, but it's a lot easier for things to stick if, we're really, we're in the brush, and, clothes are dirty, and even if we mess up, it's, we really fell into the hole, and it's like, okay, now I'm going to remember this example a little bit more closely, because, oftentimes you always see, and I'm sure we're guilty, in this regard in other spaces, but, sometimes when it's very passive, and you see what the right way to do something is, or what the right answer is, it's like, oh, of course it was like that, okay, and you just kind of go on through your day, right? But if you're, the clothes are ripped, you're a little scraped up, and it's like, oh, okay, I'm gonna remember, even if I don't understand it too well, the fact that I tried it, and I got burned, I'm still gonna remember this a little bit, and that's the foundation, right? So even if things aren't too clean, it's still very important to just go in and try and build the foundation.
Yeah, like you got to get all the pain out of the way. So on test day, you have very little pain. You want test
Yeah.
day to be the one day where there's no pain, but all the
Yeah.
way leading there, it's just pain, 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 with like sparks of, like, because as you're working through everything, like you'll master things and you move on to something you haven't mastered. Then it's that struggle again. Then you master it. Then you're moving back into things you haven't mastered yet. And you're back into the struggle. And it's just this constant like grappling with the material and struggling with it until you wrangle it and you feel like you've mastered it. And then you do that through every aspect of the test until you go up to test day.
And John, what's one thing that I thought about? I remember I was working with someone a couple months ago, and one of the things that I think was huge for that student in particular was, it really is a mindset. One thing that you said earlier on is, and how you approach this test, you really have to like change your perspective. You did emphasize that, this is a whole different beast, and we want to make sure our mindset is one that enables us to get to our goalpost, wherever it is. But skepticism is so important, right?
Yeah.
And that really ties in with what we're saying, being active versus passive. So in this one student, I would have him read things to me and I would ask him, what were your thoughts about that? Or, what was being said? And when we started, he would read me something and be like, yeah, it makes sense to me. And that was kind of a work in progress, right? Where I would tell him,
Yeah.
I really want you to critically analyze each single part, and in reading it, don't take anything for granted, right? I want you to be skeptical. I want you to think, they tell you something, what if something goes wrong? Granted, the premises, what
Right.
if the conclusion doesn't hold? And I want, for that student, in introducing that skepticism, we worked together and it was a very kind of awkward process at first, but then, he started to get a lot more comfortable, or he didn't take anything for granted, and he applied that skepticism to, to then predict answers, and to then kind of understand the different components at play. So,
Yeah.
that's
And
something.
my general run through on a question is find the conclusion and attack and weaken, like automatically, like that's what I do on every question. Find the conclusion, weaken the conclusion. What's the question stem? And then from however I weakened it, then I can phrase that as a weakener, or I can flip it to a strengthener or assumption, necessary or sufficient. You can do all sorts of things from that position, if there is an argument or if there's facts. And you had mentioned resolve the paradox questions earlier. Those are the best questions, I think, to start your prediction process, because it's not even argumentation. So you can kind of start in the simpler world of just like, here are some facts that seem to be at odds with each other. And then and it gives you the opportunity to predict what's actually going on here that makes it so this isn't such a strange situation after all.
Yeah. I also really like how one thing that we're getting at here is with a lot of these skills, they kind of build off one another, right?
Yeah.
So, in the point that we just talked about, skepticism, how you noted, attack the conclusion. What if the conclusion um, isn't valid? And from there, it's important to know that, maybe the question stem isn't asking, what's the flaw or something, but the fact that we can do it so readily,
Yeah.
um, helps us. That's at the core where we can go, like, oh, okay, if I were to strengthen this, the central component to this argument is this, and I can back it up, or if I want to weaken it, or if I want to support it. So that skepticism and the things that we're talking about kind of build into an existing framework where you can feel more comfortable and have more um, more autonomy as you're going through this, right? Rather than just being knocked left, right, left, right.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, and I do think it's also nice to have like this standardized way that you approach things. I'm a stimulus first, then question stem kind of test taker.
Same.
Are you the same, or do you flip
Yeah.
it?
I know people like to talk about that a lot, and I think when
Yeah.
I started, um, I was question first and stimulus first. But part of what we're talking about is, uh, you know, in building that base and building that skepticism. So I think when I went uh, stimulus first, then question stem, it kind of forced me to actively engage and
Yeah.
pick up on little subtleties that I wouldn't have otherwise.
Yeah, and that's one thing I do like about that approach is because you're bringing just like one mind. First,
Yeah,
like as you're reading, you're deciding is this an argument or facts? And
yeah,
then if it's facts, you're just like, all right, give me the facts, and then let me keep moving. If it's an argument, which most of them are, then you're like, where's the conclusion? Attack the conclusion. All right, what's the question stem? I already know what's wrong with this argument. What's the question stem? And then you can kind of like move through that super easily. And
yeah,
it's just you're just doing the same thing over and over and over again, thousands of times,
yeah,
where you just become like a master of this process.
yeah. And I agree with you with what you said earlier. With on this note, the power of predicting answers is very, I would agree, most easily applied to resolve the paradox, or you have one thing guiding you one way, and then oh, that came out of left field. How do we fix it?
Yeah.
Um, and then from there, right, and just in baby steps, right? It's like, oh, what like within this world, what can I play around with, right? And talking to students, or say your forums or self studying, maybe you swung, but you talked about something that wasn't relevant. It's like, okay, let me, um, I got burned there, but let me um, keep trying to see how I can um, actively predict and catch patterns.
Yeah. And like when those things happen too, look at like what the heart of what you predicted, does that match the heart
Yes.
of what the right answer choice was? Like that underlying thing that they're doing, even if it manifests in this like, you know, even wildly different way, but you're like, oh yeah, they still played on that same thing that I played on. I just went this way and they went that way. So
Yeah.
maybe I can start to look more going that way from like this like core pivot point of like, all right, I'm attacking by saying, something's wrong with the data. But I said this thing was wrong with the data, but they said this other thing was wrong with the data, and like, or whatever the case may be. But like a lot of times, you're right on the like the foundational thing that was wrong with it. You just manifested it, or like you described it in specificity in a way that was different than the way that they did it. But technically, you're on the same. Your prediction was really solid.
Yeah. Another thing that I was also thinking about was, um, this is also very helpful. I think I have one student in mind where, I was really trying to get him to practice this. And in doing this, kind of like how you're saying, sometimes you kind of catch your line of thinking, right? Like, oh, okay, I tend to think this, or like, oh, I notice I tend to go in this direction. And, I,
Yeah.
for better, I guess it, uh, that's my initial response, and it's not the right direction to go in, then you can kind of see what patterns are in play there, right? And I guess it's a little easier if you're working with a tutor or you're talking to someone, um, in catching, say, like, what comes to mind is like underlying assumptions, right? Because oftentimes you'll see, uh, I guess in practicing this, or just in general, sometimes uh, we'll make a couple steps. We'll go a couple steps too far. We'll hop a little bit too far, and it's like, oh, is that justified, right? Or we'll say,
Yeah.
oh, it should be this, but it's like, oh, should it be that? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So being mindful of
Right.
these little steps, and if and this is something in our toolbox to be aware of how we normally think, and to adjust that, as need be.
Yeah, and I think people have a bit of an issue thinking of the LSAT as this like inanimate object, or this like weird roadblock that was maybe like created by robots somewhere or something. But like there's people behind this. So if you
Yeah.
think of this as like you're building a relationship with the test or with the people behind the test, just like you would build a relationship with a professor, right? So, and different professors want different things from their students. And if you're a really good student, you learn what that professor wants, and then you start to tailor, kind of your style to what that professor wants. And then you create this kind of relationship, and you kind of know, like, oh, if I do that, they're really not going to like it. My grade's going to suffer. And then you can debate whether, like, all right, well, I still think I want to do it that way anyways. But at least you have this, going in with this understanding. With the test, it's the same thing. It's like you're meeting a new person, and you're like, oh, I can't predict what that person's going to think or say. And like, yeah, that's the way it works when you meet someone new,
Yeah.
typically. You may have some inclination, and you're probably working all broadly off of the same strokes. But, when something happens, when a loud noise happens in the room, are they uh, the type of person that's like moving towards the loud noise, or moving away from the loud noise, or they freeze? Like you can't anticipate what they're going to do in various different situations until you've spent a lot of time with them and created this relationship and this friendship. And then at some point, you feel like you can finish each
I
other's
know.
sentences. You
Yeah.
feel like you just know
Yeah.
them inside and out. They make a
Yeah.
little look at you, and you're like, oh,
Yeah.
yeah, and you're like
Yeah. All
communicating.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? So it's
Yeah.
like it's that kind of thing. So you're like building that relationship, and it just takes time, and it just takes getting used to like thinking what they're going to say, and then seeing what actually happens, or being with, and that's just like experiencing different situations with the exam, but thinking of it as this like thing that really does have intelligence behind it, that it has patterns behind it, that has predictability behind it, like people do.
Yeah. I wholeheartedly agree with that. And it's a process, right? It's really a process, and
Yeah.
um, say, I think one common thing that I'm sure we always see is, students will mix up, like essay or NA, and it's like, wait, what were the what's the world here, Evan? Let's say, what was your guess there? And even if we got wrong, like we got burned, it's okay. But um, let's talk to the test a little bit, right? If what let for this particular argument, let's give me like three sufficient assumptions, like give me like three necessary assumptions, and
Yeah.
um, you know, there's oftentimes many different ways to approach it, right? So out of left field, our guess, it wasn't the right one, but just really um, flexing those muscles and being aware of um, our patterns, in our line of thinking, but also in how um, the test talks to us. Because little by little, it's usually not going to be a pretty process, but you really can reach a point, like you said, where you're reading it and it's like, oh, okay, like, come on already, like, just, or like in reading comp, they're, I have students look at and be like, okay, I really want you to pay attention to, has the author's opinion come out? Like, whose opinion are we talking? Okay, we're talking about
Yeah.
other researchers, like,
Yeah.
any like slight connotations or things that we can catch is like, wait for it, they're probably going to switch around, and then we have a contrasting opinion, or um what the author's voice comes through. So it's a lot of these things, it's um you're going to get it burned at first, but
Yeah.
in trying, you can communicate and make it a little bit more of a easier process.
Yeah. And there is some students who feel like, oh, like every test is somehow different, or you hear this a lot on test day, that
Yeah.
like, man, test day was
This one was, yeah,
this one was so different than
yeah,
any of the other ones. And then the practice test comes out. This is the way it used to be. Then it would come out as a practice test, and everyone would look at it, and no one would say anything about it
yeah,
as a practice test. It's
yeah,
just on test day they felt it was different because they didn't have a deep enough understanding of the material, that when they were a little bit out of their element and a little bit nervous and a little bit, like when their emotions were running a little bit higher, that I feel like they just didn't have this super deep connection with the test, that they were still able to predict really well and feel like, all right, this relationship is still the same as it always was. It's just me that's a little bit out of my normal mentality that I was in my practice test, because there's less pressure and through my
yeah,
homework and stuff.
yeah. And a lot of what you're saying in there boils down to familiarity, right? So,
Yeah.
um, say, big game day, worked really hard for this. Um, One way to really ease the nerves is, you've walked through the park so much, right? You've taken the punches, you've gone to a point where you can communicate and expect certain things at a test better than from when you first started. Um, yeah, that's something. I guess there's always going to be jitters, there's always going to be nerves,
Of
but
course. Yeah.
um, this is definitely something in a toolbox that it's going to be hard to implement, but the value in implementing it can increase study quality by a lot.
Yeah. And so you have this, like, you want to come from this skeptical point of view. Like, let me give you like I don't know, some sort of made up argument, and then just tell me like what you think like what you think about this, and like how you may attack it. So um, if I said something like, no human on earth has ever jumped more than a 5 foot vertical. I don't know what the real numbers are, but this is my
Mm.
argument. No human on earth has ever jumped more than a 5 foot vertical. Therefore, Larry will not be able to jump more than a 5 foot vertical.
And that right there is beautiful, right? Because I think a lot of students should be like, yeah, like, no way Larry can do that. But
Right.
is Larry a
Okay.
person?
Sure. Right. Is Larry a person? Maybe
Yeah,
Larry's a kangaroo.
maybe he's a kangaroo. But that's exactly what we're getting at, right? Where it's, don't take anything for granted, and they know they're gonna play and try to sway this in a particular way, but it's always, I think, keep it simple. Granted premises, what if not conclusion, right? And then uh yeah, you're being mindful of the subject, what world we're in, but that's something that just came to
Yeah.
mind
And
immediately.
speaking of worlds, like I mentioned, it's on Earth. Is Larry on Earth, or is Larry an
Exactly.
astronaut on the moon,
Yeah.
where maybe his vertical may be
Yeah.
increased?
Yeah. The zero gravity. Hello.
Right. Yeah,
Everyone's
let's
Michael
go.
Jordan. Yeah.
Right. And there's also a temporal flaw built in there
Yeah.
too. Like no one's ever done it before.
Yeah. What's to say?
Therefore, it won't happen now or in the future. So there's all these things. Is Larry a human? Is this on Earth? Um, is this actually a human like ceiling, or is it just something that we haven't figured out yet? Or also we could say, is there some sort of technology involved? Does Larry have
Yeah.
like bionic legs,
Yeah.
or a rocket pack? So there's even more stuff you could dig around and be like, well, what if this? What if that? What if that? Oh, what if that happened?
And it's so funny because I think in showing this, the listeners can really just play around, right? I always like to encourage my students to make examples that are very simple, so they can see the relationship at play, and then make it personal to themselves, right? Maybe they like, I've had a lot of students like NBA and NFL, so we put in some like sports analogies, or just
Yeah.
mimic the structure of the argument. But like we did right there, it's such a simple, those two sentences I said, but there's so much, there's all these different ways to play with it, and you can get really imaginative, right? So I think, so different things are going to come naturally to different people, but just working through that process of, okay, this is what you've given me, granted premises, what if not conclusion? one thing I'll also say is I like the temporal aspect that you said a lot, because I think that's one that kind of goes under the radar, where
Yeah.
some people, at least I found that's one that isn't considered as much, but that's one that they play with a lot, right? Just because it
Yeah.
hasn't been found or hasn't been done, what's to say that it'll continue, that there will be continuity. There's nothing to suggest that.
Yeah. Yeah. And anytime times come up, I always think a temporal flaw. If it's never been done, or past, present, future, any sort of markers.
We've never found it before. It's like,
Right.
okay,
Yeah,
what if,
well, we can find it.
yeah. And there's, John, right? There's always so many, like, once you get comfortable in talking with the exam, there's always, like, oh, we're finding some fossils, or they'll give you a setup, or, this, or some comparative thing, like, oh, this, uh, this math test was so much harder than the English test. Therefore, the math test must have been must have been like the hardest, or must have been very, very difficult.
Yeah.
It was like kindergarten, like,
Yeah.
there's so many, you should be primed to, call out the components, or how they do these things. And, it's going to be tough at first, but just going through this process is, invaluable.
Yeah. And yeah, like back to that math test, like if the math test was significantly harder than the English test, you should be asking, well, what if the English test was ridiculously easy? Or what if the English test was a kindergarten English test?
Yeah.
And it's college age students taking it. So like whenever they give you the information, instead of saying like, oh yeah, that sounds pretty good, you should be asking questions. Well, what if this happens? Or did you take into account this? Do we have this information? And like, really, like if there was another person there and you could ask them, a handful of questions, what are the most important questions you would want to know to figure out whether you agree with that conclusion, or you maybe think you need more evidence to get there?
And one thing I'll also say, John, is in talking about this, it's maybe, those listening, it almost sounds a little silly, like how imaginative we're getting. Like, oh, what do you mean Mars? But hey, we just specified Earth.
Yeah. There was a clue
Yeah.
there, right?
Yes.
Like,
yes.
otherwise they say it's impossible, and or that no one's ever done it before.
Yeah.
But like, like they're leaving little clues in there as to how, like what kinds of questions we might want to ask. But yeah, continue.
And a lot of that, I think one thing that I found to be very helpful in talking to students is just go in and think, what if, right? Granted premises, okay, this is the stage that you set up for me. What if not conclusion? And all these little, and I'm sure, listeners can make an example and just mimic, the structure that we did. But there's so many different ways to just kind of get in that world and just imagine, mess things around, being mindful of what parts they gave you.
For sure. So I guess the big takeaway here is predict. It's gonna be terrible, clunky, time consuming, and horrible at the beginning, but it'll become automatic by the end, and you will connect with the test in a way you can't connect in any other way.
Yes.
All right, JP. As always, fantastic chatting with you. I'll see you next week.
Likewise. Yeah. Bye, guys. Bye.